Bangladesh.
Wow. Ah, wow. I thought you had returned already. But yes. You had on Friday, right?
Yeah, I just finished a 3-day workshop, which was amazing. But you know how
Awesome.
these in-person workshops are really intense now. After. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to start up, and not particularly concerned about attendance, because we're going to record this. In fact, we already have it recording on, with your permission, and share the results, the outcome of our discussions. We're going to summarize it, put it on our website of the Transformations community, and share it on social media platforms. This theme, what we're doing today, is really important to us in the Transformations community. After we've had 5 successful conferences over the last 12 years or so, and we're planning our next one next year in Sydney. And but we're also trying to do more than the conferences these days. We're thinking, well, how can we support a community of practice of folks who define themselves as transformations practitioners, or action researchers, or reflective practitioners, pracademics, if you will, in many cases, people who are kind of the knowledge action folks, the praxis, operating at that interface. And so what we've decided is that one of the most important things that many people in our community are involved in is transformations organizations of a kind, initiatives that seem to enhance the capacity of transformative projects to be effective, to be places where learning happens, where innovation happens, where prospects for scaling actually occur, and that they often bring together multiple sites and operate at multiple scales. And these organizations tend to be kind of thinly institutionalized. They're not formal organizations often. They call themselves T-Labs, or communities of practice, or learning networks, or whatnot. Usually they have some kind of facilitation. Someone is, or some group of people is in charge of making sure that the interaction that takes place is worthwhile for the participants, who are often there voluntarily, and that people stay on track, but don't become too tracked, because they also want to encourage a kind of autonomy, a kind of independence, for people to do things that are appropriate in the settings in which they're operating. So these tensions are sometimes something we see managers trying to balance. So we thought, let's focus on that. And let's really develop capacity within the transformations community to do that kind of work effectively, to create and hold space for catalyzing transformative capacity, making transformations happen, and to understand how that works. So over the next year, we're going to be looking at a variety of different case studies of successful or unsuccessful or ongoing or concluded projects that are trying to hold space for transformations initiatives. And we're going to be partnering with people who are developing techniques and tools in this domain, also maybe doing casework and trying to understand these initiatives, also actually being the organizers and facilitators and the people who are managing these efforts and participating in them, and create dialogue for active capacity building. So the lessons that we learn about how to manage these things effectively can germinate and fertilize the next generation of projects. So in that spirit, this, our third dialogue that we've had at the SRI conference, is focused on this a really, to our eyes, super interesting initiative that brought together a variety of initiatives on different continents, in the spirit of co-learning, in the spirit of mutual support, and bringing people together, not only to support their individual initiatives, but to come together and share ideas. And so we're really curious, how did it go? What was it like for the people involved? What was were the outcomes different than if things had been done independently? Questions like that. And that's what we're here to address. So we're really excited to have folks from the Pathways Network here joining us, who had a multi-year experience in this network. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask a set of questions after hearing introductions from each person who will describe their role in the network and their, the kinds of work that they do that brought them to the network. And then we have a set of questions about kind of the organizational structure of the Pathways Network. How is it led? How did learning take place? What was the impact? And then we want to, in the last stage of our conversation, think about how can we support other efforts like this? How can we support learning within our community about how to do this kind of work, kind of meta learning about how to support learning, if you will. And how can we prepare people to better be involved in these kinds of initiatives and also lead them? And this is work the transformations community wants to pick up over the next few years and is already engaged in. So we're hoping if you're listening to this, you have an interest in this kind of topic, you come join us in some of these conversations. So we're going to hold questions and active feedback from folks outside the panel. Really super psyched that you're here, though. And please put your name and your location in chat, everyone who's participating, just so we have a sense of who's here. As we go, if you have questions, if you have comments, please put them in chat. And Nick Graham, our chief weaver of the transformations community, there's Nick. He's going to gather them up and then provide you with an opportunity to ask those questions at the end of our discussion. So do put those questions in chat. We'll get to them at the end of our discussion and create some more dialogue then. So why don't we begin with 5-minute or so introductions from each of the members and participants in the Pathways Network that are here, and welcome you all. So let's see, David, would you be willing to begin?
Sure, why not? So it's an introduction and positionality statement maybe as well. I was born in Barcelona, but I'm currently a settler and immigrant to Arizona in the US. And for most of my adult life, I have been playing the games of Western Eurocentric academia and getting good enough at it as to attain an associate professor position in sustainability at ASU, Arizona State University. Back in 2018, I got this associate professor position, but that year, 2018, was a turning point for me. I started a process of personal and professional transformation that is still ongoing. And like most transformations, it was triggered by some dissatisfaction with the current state. I wanted to step out of the hamster wheel of academic accomplishments with its constant pressure for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, the pressure to publish as much as possible, this idea that you are measuring yourself up against some metrics that you didn't decide that at this point in my life, they were no longer meaningful or motivating, and so on. So my transformation away from the academic treadmill, if you will, was enabled by spending a wonderful sabbatical year in the Ecuadorian Amazon, trying to, not to study it, but to build a long-term relationship with the rainforest and with the people inhabiting it. And this transformation was not intellectual, but embodied and somatic in a sense. I did not need to change my mind. I had been working with indigenous people in Latin America since my PhD, and I had always been supportive of indigenous knowledges, and I was aware of the importance of preserving the forest and so on, but building a closer relationship with the Amazon, which is one of the most intense ecosystems on Earth, and with its people, provided me with the inspiration to undo and learn and disable my Western Eurocentric academic conditioning. So that was the process of transformation that I was talking about. And then this is important because my participation in the Pathways Network, which is the focus of this session, took place in the context of this personal and professional transformation. And I must say that the open-mindedness of the people and the epistemological openness of the network itself were really useful for me to create bridges between this emerging self, this new self, perhaps more decolonized or indigenized, and my older academic self, because I'm still a professor, largely operating within the colonial structures of Western academia. So it's from this position, from the position of being in this ongoing process of transformation and participating in the network that I'm here to discuss my experience.
Thanks, Debbie. That's a great opening. Let's go on to our next participant. Let's see, Adrian, would you step up?
Sure. Thanks, David. That was really interesting, actually. I didn't know all of those things, so it's fantastic to hear it. And I think I'm going to try and follow your lead and give just an account of the positionality from which I have been viewing and also interacting with this process of the Pathways Network. So yeah, I'm a Brit, born in the UK and grew up here, and trained originally in natural sciences, biology, conservation biology, ecology, and also molecular biology and biotech. And also over the years I've had, periods where I've been involved in conservation and development projects and programs, but also campaigning, environmental campaigning. And all of that before I came to academia at Sussex, which is where I'm based now, 22 years ago, and started work in science and technology policy. So I'm based at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. My original interest was really in the regulation and governance of biotechnology, but I also found myself at the end of my PhD, which finished in 2006, in an extremely fortunate position to be at Sussex when the STEP Centre was initiated. So this was a collaboration between my department and the Institute of Development Studies, and funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. And I worked within STEPS for many years, the duration of the 15 years that it existed, as a researcher, but also with an impact and communications and engagement hat on. And that's really what I think has motivated me through the more recent years of my career. And I was also, I could say, extremely lucky also to find myself at the STEP Centre when this opportunity for the Pathways Transformative Network came about. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of how it emerged and its organisation. But I co-led the network, at least nominally, with Annabel Marin, who was based in Argentina at the time. And it's just been a huge journey and learning experience. It's been great to work with so many fantastic colleagues around the world, and it's a real privilege for us to be able to reflect together on those lessons and experiences. So thanks very much to Bruce and the community for organising today's session.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Marina, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Agree, it's really interesting to hear a bit more about our colleagues. You may be working with people for many years, but sometimes there are bits that you don't know. So I'm Marina Apgar, and today I'm in Dhaka in Bangladesh. I was just saying before, I've just finished a 3-day workshop, so getting back into the reality of working in person, which is, I guess, a big part of my journey and story, which is spending quite a lot of time in facilitation mode, starting with work in Latin America, working with indigenous communities, working in Panama and Peru and Ecuador. And through those experiences, really starting to deepen reflections on what it means to be part of a community and what it means to engage in participatory development. So I'm originally from Greece, but I'm a mix. So I've got some New Zealand blood and some American blood. So I've always been a kind of weaving together different parts of the world and different ways of kind of viewing the world. So that's what brought me into action research. And that's what I'm still sort of my main identity today, as a research fellow based at the Institute of Development Studies, which is located at the University of Sussex in the UK. And so there I'm part of a team that works on participation, inclusion, and social change. And I guess we think of ourselves as, I think someone talked about pracademics earlier, Bruce, you mentioned. So very much in that in-between space, 1 foot in the kind of sense making and reflection and knowledge generation, and 1 foot in the doing and the action and the creating change. And I'm particularly interested in how participatory methodologies actually enable change. So that's my kind of research agenda. And I use evaluation methodologies. And so that helps to build some critical reflection around how these processes work, but for whom also, and under what conditions. And so that's kind of what links me into the Pathways Network. So I'm the relative kind of, I don't know if outside is the right term, but I came into the network at a later stage. So when I came to IDS and then joined the STEP Center, and I'll talk a little bit more later about kind of how the network was thinking about evaluation. But yeah, part of my role was to support the team to reflect on the learning that it was generating and to think about questions around impact evaluation and causality. And yeah, thanks. It's great to have the opportunity to chat with you all.
Oops, I was muted. Laura, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. Apologies for being late. I was literally on another panel discussion at the Scenarios Forum in IASA here in Luxembourg in Austria. And that was in person, so I couldn't do the dual multiple headphone thing, which I think has tragically become a bit of the default situation for us over the past few years. Yeah, so nice to be forced to be in person and not have to go through that. I also hope the internet connection is good, but it seems to be going well. Everyone's video is clear. So I guess the mandate is just a little bit of a brief introduction of who we are, why we're here. And yeah, I come from everyone asks me, introduce yourself, what is it you do? And I think, I say I'm generally confused. I think that's about the only disciplinary angle that I could really come up with. I've trained from undergrad, ecology, zoology and law. I then did human geography in the UK, came back into a little bit more climate impacts geography. I've been in business schools and governance schools and all of the rest. But I sort of landed in the space of thinking through sustainability transformations, but from a global South perspective. So trying to put more of an equity, equality, development hat on and really unpacking what we mean by development. And I guess that's just default of sort of being South African and sort of constantly finding yourself in the space as the African representative, right? In many instances. And I think that was largely what the role I was fulfilling now at Scenarios Forum, and to be able to critically unpack that and actually open up spaces for actual inclusion and representation. Because I think that it's only from that space of being able to recognize actual diversity and different perspectives that we really can think about the sorts of deep transformations that we need to undertake if we're actually going to get somewhere more desirable over the next 100 years. And I think that that's what the Pathways project offered, actually, was a very broad scope of a variety of different people thinking in different sectors, but really unpacking difficult questions, because transformations aren't easy. And to go into these processes to learn, we were, a lot of the time you're kind of making it up as you go along, but you're learning together, and I think something more beneficial comes out of that exchange. And that's what I really appreciated with this project. And kind of similar to Marina, I was also sort of thrust into it it was at the beginning, but it was because my colleague Pereira at the SRC couldn't actually make it to the opening meeting in Argentina, and sort of sent me in his stead. It was like, go and explain T-Labs. I was like, what's a T-Lab? Explain to me so I can explain to them. It's like, well, we're not really sure, but go and come up with some slides and we'll sort of see how it emerges at the other end. And I think that actually starting from that basis of, well, there's some general principles, but actually we need to see what works in place space and to be able to have that exchange of how, well, in Mexico, this is what emerged. And in Kenya, this is actually what we were discussing. And there's some common principles, but there are also differences, and that's okay. That there's nothing wrong with that, and that you don't have a very clear-cut comparable set of case studies that you can sort of put in boxes. And I really appreciated that aspect of it. So yeah, a little bit of sort of where I came from and how I landed up in the project, and also why my head at the moment is thinking about scenarios and inclusion and climate change and SSP. So I'm going to try and get into really focusing on the discussions here as quick as I can, but great to be here with you all.
Thanks, Laura. I don't know if any of the rest of you are feeling like me. I feel like this is sort of like a gathering of like transformation superheroes. Like what is the thing that pulled them together, and what was the structure that created this sort of legion and what was the what was the value added for each of these incredibly busy people operating in all their different domains? What kind of structure would hold them together in something worthwhile? And so let's start that discussion up. Adrian, as the co-facilitator and organizer of this, tell us a little bit about this concept and the design of the Pathways Network. How was it structured in order to engage all these people in all their separate initiatives and support engagement between them?
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I will do that. I'm going to use some slides to do so, if that's okay. So hopefully people can see these. The first is just a title slide, but I think that there are some really important bits on it. I mean, the bits at the top, the logos at the top are the funders, and that have been important. I noticed in the abstract that it said some of these networks are voluntary, and I think that a lot of the energy that came through the work was not paid for. It was a lot of it was voluntary, but this was a project and it was a funded project, so it's important to recognize that. The STEP Centre is Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability, which Marina already mentioned, funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. But the project, the kind of Pathways Network, was fortunate to receive funding from the Transformations to Sustainability Programme, which was run by the International Science Council, conceived as a social science-led initiative when it was the International Social Science Council, and drawing on funding from Swedish CEDA. So, and they've also allowed our participation in this conference, so thanks to them. But also all of these logos at the bottom, this is the 8 organizations that, academic organizations that were involved in the project. You've heard about the Institute of Development Studies Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, Arizona State University, the African Centre for Technology Studies, which had been working with STEPS for some time and initiated a hub, STEPS Africa, as you can see there. Likewise, CENIT, the Centre for the Research on Transformation, based in Argentina, had created STEPS Latin America. And Stockholm Resilience Centre, which is where we drew Laura from, at least for at the beginning of the project. Beijing Normal University, it was really interesting to be working with Chinese colleagues there. Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and UNAM, the National Autonomous University in Mexico. Stellenbosch is down there as well, and I think that that's where Laura ended up towards the end of the project. So, a really diverse group of organizations that, as you say, were brought together through a number of exchanges and interactions and collaborations that predated the TKN in many ways, at least at the institutional level, and in many cases at the individual level. But we were provided with this funding through the Transformations to Sustainability Programme. And so that really gave us a lot of impetus to do work in our various localities, but also really importantly to work explicitly to foster this co-learning. So these are the different hubs. And one of the techniques that we used to foster that co-learning in a selection of such diverse contexts, but also sustainability challenges, was to actually pair up hubs that were working on similar issues in similar sectors or around similar problems. So the Argentina hub and the UK hub were both working on agri-food systems. Colleagues in Mexico and India were working on cities and water, and colleagues from Kenya and China were working on energy and inclusive low carbon green growth. So that sounds very neat. It wasn't as neat as that. They were working on very, very different aspects of these things, but at least that gave them enough to talk about across those hubs. And we were able to pay for exchanges, in-person exchanges, especially for early career researchers. And we also fostered that co-learning through co-learning blogs between those paired hubs. And I think that both of those worked really pretty well. But there was this wider aspect of learning that was across the network as well. And I think it's worth spending a bit of time describing how that was facilitated, at least from my point of view, in terms of the design of the project. We had all of these hubs, which we called them, that had developed concept notes in an earlier seed funding phase of the program. They'd identified their own sustainability challenges in place, many of which they'd been working on previously. And so when the formal project started in 2016, it's important to say that a lot of this was about a continuation of research and engagement in place rather than a new piece of work. So the research predated, and in some cases the relationships predated the work. The project was formally 3 years, but actually we carried on for a lot longer than that, at least another 2 years. And I guess you could say that that was voluntary on the basis of the commitments that we had. But in each of these hubs, we ran these T labs, which Laura's probably best placed to talk about. She was the one who told us what they were at the initiation workshop in Argentina. But as she said, we experimented with them in each of those localities. And we thought about how to do that at the Inception workshop. We came up with what we've called anchors. So the methodological anchor was this idea of a T-lab, a transformation laboratory, which provided us with a language, but also flexibility to think about how different methods were brought in to suit the contexts, but also theoretical anchors. The pathways approach, this set of concepts that the STEP Centre has developed with its collaborators, have been quite important and were introduced in the Inception workshop, but many people knew about them already. And just like T-Labs, they were malleable and we experimented with them, took or left certain aspects in our work and learned along the way. We needed to provide some kind of a structure, or enough of a structure, I think, that allowed us to work, come back and reflect and learn from each other, go away and learn again. So this kind of iterative co-learning approach. And so we organized the 3 years around 2 cycles of T-Lab workshops. Now, T-Labs are a process, but we had specific events. And it was in between those events that we reflected upon the way that we've been working in each of the hubs. And alongside the Transformations conference in Dundee, Scotland in 2017, we actually ran a workshop to reflect, share our experiences and think about what we needed to do differently and better in each of those localities. We also did that again at the end in the final workshop, which was hosted by our colleagues at Nairobi, at the African Centre for Technology Studies. And through the period, we collected reflections and insights through surveys. So those were kind of questions that each of the hubs responded to about why did you use a particular method? What went wrong? What went right? What would you like to bring to the discussion? And all of that really fed into the subsequent work that we did afterwards. There was a journal article in Sustainability. Actually, Laura also produced a journal article, I think in Sustainability Science, which drew on some of these cases. And there's an open access book. I think Nick can share the links to those. So I guess the overarching message here is there was some structure, but actually the flexibility and the ownership that was taken by the individual hubs was a more important aspect, I think.
Great. Are your slides all done, Adrian?
Yeah, I'm just gonna.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Laura, I wonder if you would maybe give us a little bit more in depth on some of this aspects of structure, particularly the T-Labs, which presumably at this point you're familiar with the slides that you presented, and can comment a little bit on the structure and the process there.
Yeah, sure thing. And I see Nick is putting some of the links into the chat, so you can follow up more on that. I mean, in essence, when we were starting off, like that first meeting in Argentina, there had been social innovation labs led by Francis Wesley that sort of started as the foundation of like what we were thinking about with labs. And I think now you're seeing sort of their labs everywhere, right? You've got living labs, urban labs, T labs, social innovation, like everything's a lab at the moment. At the time, I think that was just kind of starting up. But sort of one of the core focuses that we had, particularly with this idea of sustainability as a core component, but also coming from the Stockholm Resilience Center perspective, was that actually we were thinking of working through challenges that were social ecological in nature, that had to have that connection between the social and the ecological, and they needed to be complex. It couldn't be something that you just wanted to solve a problem where actually if you just got policy X in place, like you'd be fine. These had to be quite complex challenges. And so, you know, we're looking at watershed management in Xochimilco. There was sort of energy transitions in Kenya. The China case was really interesting because that also evolved over time, became much more of a question sort of labor and transitions, which was really interesting. Then there was sort of food in the other two cases. So everything from seeds at the national level in Argentina through to sort of much more Brighton and Hove focused work in the Sussex team. And so just looking at that broad range, you know, you needed to understand that, social ecological, complex, but you know, that's really the only constraint in terms of what we're thinking of from a challenge perspective. So it was really left to be open. And then again, it was to try and not be too prescriptive in the types of methods that were used. So I think, I mean, this is probably also largely because Lakshmi in the Mexico case was actually doing her PhD around this. And so sort of there was a really rigorous sort of use of methods and kind of measurement of change over time that they were actually able to do in that case study, from the use of avatars all the way through to sort of other kinds of networking processes. And so, it was about, can you think of this challenge? Who do you need to have in the room in order to start addressing some of these challenges, and particularly emphasizing, well, sometimes you don't want to have power in the room, even though that's ultimately where the change needs to have. Maybe you just need to start off with the more marginalized voices, and that's going to be a very different kind of tool or a very different kind of convening process, you know. And so in different cases, like the who's in the room was going to be different, and therefore the what you do when you're in the room is also going to be different. But we recognize that there was some level of diversity that needed to happen, like just thinking through the who and the agency that they might have to change, because you also don't want to bring people into a room to talk about addressing complex challenges when there's actually very little that they can do about them, right? There was an ethical question, I think, around that convening. And as Adrian mentioned, you know, we were focusing around these workshops, but it was actually also the process over time, what happened in between the workshops. You needed to make sure that you got to a place where something, and this is leading from the social innovation labs, something could be done, an experiment, a prototype, an action of some sort that you could test out to see whether this could start shifting, whether this was starting to address some of the needs. and then bring that back into a subsequent follow-up meeting. So you can never just have sort of one workshop and call it a TLAB, because if you're really thinking about transformations, obviously you're not going to necessarily see the fundamental shift. But if you're, you need to start instigating things with this longer term systemic sort of process in mind. And so, yeah, I guess that was kind of the overarching structure that we used. And I think that it proved to be sufficiently flexible in many of the cases. I think that the India team in particular, but that's because they'd also had a lot of work and, sort of years and years of experience in that community of having done things. Where this idea of a TLAB of like do something, come up with an idea and come back wasn't necessarily the most useful way of looking at it. So also the idea of that, well, not everything maybe needs a TLAB. There are probably other tools or other sort of methods that you could use if you want to think through transformation, more scenarios, futures, methods, etc. Yeah, so I think that was the main sort of take home around the methodological idea of TLABs, which I think is becoming a little bit more pervasive now. And just the final point on that, I think, and this comes to the meta-analysis we did on this idea of transformative spaces, that because so many of the examples or everything apart from the UK one was in a global South context, you were really grappling with different contexts, different histories, sort of different kinds of power dynamics. And I think that really strengthened what came out at the end, because it had to be contested. It wasn't all going to be similar. And I think that was an important aspect of the methodological approach.
Great. Thanks, Laura. David, I wonder if you could give us, your perspective on this structure on the TLABs as a participant. Especially I have in mind your introduction and looking for some alternative, more engaging, more meaningful kinds of engagement than what is ordinarily available to us in the academic game. What was your experience like? How did this kind of play out for you?
Yeah, as others have mentioned, the flexibility part was very important methodologically, right? But also coming to the process without a specific outcome in mind, or not being too worried about what academic products you're going to generate. I think that was fundamental, and allow for the creativity. I think from the experience of my hub, what happened is that the researchers who were organizing the process at the beginning needed to drop their roles, right? Needed to learn needed to question their expectations and be open to create a relationship with the people participating that was more personal, and that would allow to bring their knowledges and their perspectives in a symmetric way, right? In a horizontal way. So it was a lot of the work was to drop the academic hat and to be creative in the process. And also one aspect of the organization that hasn't been mentioned yet, I think, is the international character of it and the north-south type of the dynamic between the hubs, right? And we try to foster a lot of collaboration between two specific hubs, right? In our case, it was Mexico and India and all that. And we organized that initially according to the theme, right? So both we were working both on water or both on, and that's a very academic way of thinking still, right? But it turns out that maybe more important than the theme was the culture that each hub had. And it was culture in general, like at the end, of course, the North American hub and the South American hub had more of a common cultural background. But more than that, it was, I think, the culture of doing research, the culture of interacting with the research subjects or objects, and the positionality that each hub had a different idea of what their positionality was in relation to their case, to their place. And I think at the end, that aspect maybe was more important than working on a particular subject area, right? Or a particular problem. So these are the ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, it sounds like people had to kind of rethink their identity and their relationships. Maybe could you give us kind of an example of something along those lines, if it's possible to share?
Well, in the case of Mexico, right, which is the one I know the most. In the case of Xochimilco, we had to initially these lots of preconceptions about the conservation, what conservation meant in the area, what preservation of the ecosystem, what type of socio-ecological outcomes we were expecting or trying to transform into or towards, right? And we initially were organizing the process unconsciously almost to promote or foster this type of outcomes, right? And through the process of interacting with the place and going there and interacting with the people, we realized that not only the research teams, but the original participants that we had chosen were biased towards that perspective, right? And we needed to incorporate other important agents that didn't share maybe that perspective or that approach, urban settlers, and so in a sense we needed to realize where we were coming from and what was a more realistic way of approaching the issue. I think that counts as an example there.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I often think of transformations initiatives like this, labs, networks, communities, as relying on a different approach to leadership and different kinds of leadership roles than we're customary to experience in conventional organizations. And and sometimes that doesn't even look like conventional leadership with traditional forms of planning and authority. Laura, I wonder if you could give us some ideas about what does leadership look like in an initiative like this, in a network like this? How is it structured? How is responsibility for convening, for facilitating, for holding dialogue, holding space? How is it distributed? And in your perspective, what was learned along the way? What turned out to be particularly effective?
Sure. Easy question, Bruce. Leadership. And it's actually just something that we've been thinking about around this transformational leadership academy that they're trying to start around food in the African continent. Literally, Africa led from Wageningen, because that's a very typical way of looking at these things. And I think probably the best reflection that I have, and I think Adrian might be the better person because he actually had to steer us through all the mad messiness and sort of actually meet the deadlines while we were off on a tangent, was actually about making sure that there was sufficient ownership and agency in each of the different areas, that we needed to have a collective idea and share and communicate, but that each of the hubs knew that they could do different things, that you had that freedom to experiment. And I think that it was about guiding that flexibility still under the banner of a coherent project. That for me would have been the leadership aspect, to sort of provide guidance and inputs and sort of steer people like, I'm confused, what is it? What should I be doing? Okay, let's play around with this, but then also allowing for what needed to be done or what was most appropriate in the different contexts to actually take that on. And I think that was a particularly important component of this project. And I think what allowed us to really explore the complete space of what could be happening. I think also, it was still billed as an academic project, and we still did get some academic outputs at the end that they maybe were a little bit more difficult to think through than maybe more of your conventional ones. But that you had a transdisciplinary process in play, and so there was also making sure that expectations were being met, that the communities that have been involved continue to actually sort of be engaged. And that was, the hub leaders, but, that also needed to fit into the overall project. And I think that herding those cats was another important component of the leadership aspect. And I feel like what I'm doing is saying apologies on this, but if I don't leave, they're going to strand me here in Luxembourg, and the bus leaves at 6. So at some point I might put my video off and I'll still try and listen, but my severe apologies for being completely unable to coordinate time in any shape, size or form. But it was really lovely to see you all and to have the chance to reflect on this process.
Oh, you are always on the run. I think our last conversation was in a supermarket. You're like, there's a Latour's book of laboratory life. You're like that person who's halfway out the door. Well, thank you for joining us. I hope you can stay as long as you can, and we'll be recording this as well, sharing the insights as we go. So I want to turn the same conversation, the same topic, over to Adrian as a designated lead. What was your experience like? Did this experience kind of challenge some of your ideas of what leadership would look like, or how would you apply it? Did you reorient your approach over time? Tell us a few of the things you learned as an officially designated lead in this, about how to do this kind of work effectively.
So, I mean, I think that my main reflection is that we had the structure to the extent that it was laid out, as I previously said. But actually, the most important aspect of the work was what was happening in places. And it was the transdisciplinary interaction. And the people in those places were really into that. Yeah, the team members were really, really into the work that they were doing on the ground. And in the cases where things didn't go to plan, or deadlines were missed, or some of the more formal outputs didn't arrive, which obviously happens, I trusted. I knew that actually that's probably because there was more important stuff happening on the ground. So I guess there's some flexibility about that, but that very much relies on yes, trusting those individuals, but also having the kind of people who are deeply committed to the work that they're doing. And apart from that, I mean, it was a strange, I was designated leader, but I was by no means the most senior person in the network. There were senior professors in other parts of the network, and some of the people who ended up being most active and shaping the thinking and the work that we did were some of the most junior. And I think Lakshmi's already been mentioned. Lakshmi Charlie Joseph did some really amazing work around methods, which involved some herding of cats as well. So not easy for a PhD student to do, but she certainly did. But yeah, it wasn't a traditional kind of hierarchy, and luckily that was the culture that was shared across each of these hubs. And yeah, I was lucky to be put into that position.
Yeah, I was at a recent meeting and discussing some aspects of network leadership and how it's about holding things in tension instead of resolving. So, and I think we've touched on some of those themes here. The idea that there's coherence in a network, but there's also autonomy, and that there's action in a network, but there's also reflection, and that you don't want to necessarily pull it toward one pole or another, but you want to kind of create that dynamic tension between these two poles that kind of yield some emergent property, if you will. And one of those tensions that is often held, it seems, is between love, connection, relationships, seeing the other, and dissent, difference, discord. And discord is a productive activity within a learning situation. Did you see that tension as a leader, and how did you manage it, or was it just a very congenial group that never got into any degree of difference?
There was certainly difference. I'm not going to go into the details, but there was a lot of
trying to pull it out of you.
No, I mean, there were certainly very, very different approaches, intellectual approaches, but also approaches to how you interact with academic and non-academic partners. I mean, I think David touched upon that as well. Some very different institutional cultures at play among the network.
Was it a problem to be managed, or was it a resource for creativity?
It was tough, and it caused a lot of pain at points, but yeah, it did turn out great at the end. And so I guess it was productive, but there were some painful moments along the way.
Yeah, how did you address them? I know you probably can't go into the specifics, but in a generic sense, tell us.
Maintaining lines of connection and communication, and trying to empathize across such different contexts, and explain to colleagues about those differences. I mean, there are a lot of experienced people in the network. Being to some extent in the middle of it, I was interacting with all of the hubs more than any of the other hubs, if you see what I mean. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of sandwiched in the middle, and so was in a position, I think, to explain the different context in which others were working.
Yeah, David, I think you might have something, in sort of talking about a situation of dissent or disruption that might have turned out in a way that was beneficial for the network.
Yeah, following the discussion in the chat, right? There was this person, an artist, who it made us realize that when you convene some participants who have not been part of this process and who come from a very different area, there are lots of expectations that you have about what the participants are going to do, how they are going to behave, that are not met, right? And that's exactly what happened. And at the beginning, it was perceived by us, as being someone who is very self-centered and someone who is very loud and bringing, disrupting the communication and the process. And we ended up many meetings saying, "Oh my God, what are we going to do to accommodate this?" But then it made us realize that precisely that's what you need, right? That's where the opportunities for disruptive transformation emerge, with people who are not playing by the expectations or the rules that you were imagining at the beginning. And I think that's by Laura. That's an important lesson that we should actually try to invite or to recruit people who are very different to us, who don't have the experience of being socialized in the type of spaces that we have been socialized, and then endure the pain, endure the disruption, and find the resources to channel that into a positive or productive endeavor, because of course too much disruption can be also lead to chaos and disillusionment and just abandoning the process, right? I think that's
so there's sort of a period of toleration or accommodation or learning, but you saw a benefit emerge through that once that commitment had been made.
Yeah, exactly. In retrospect, it was the best thing that could happen. Sometimes you want to keep things under certain parameters, and that's a mistake in a sense, right?
Yeah. Did any of the other participants in the panel have a story or a comment on this feature?
I mean, if I could come back to the question of particularly to Adrian of how did he navigate it, in the leadership. I think there were two really important things that were part of the design as well. So the mention of flexibility. I think when you're navigating and bringing together different people, different perspectives, and you're trying to work with that creative tension, being able to actually allow some flexibility in context, right? So that those differences can also have their way of being. So it's not like you're trying to structure everything into something, right? Where big differences can actually make or break it, right? But having some flexibility within it enables, I think, you to play with difference and diversity in an interesting way. I think the other point, Adrian, is that you also were co-leading with Annabelle. And I think so actually having a co-leadership model is also a way to facilitate, if you like, collaboration and embody it, right, in the way in which you lead. Albeit Adrian possibly holding much of the kind of administrative responsibility from Sussex, but working very closely with Annabelle. And so you don't have, if you like, all of the power in one leader, but that's also shared across, I think, is another really, really important skill. And then just finally, I think the kind of buckets and buckets of emotional intelligence and care that Adrian and Annabelle both brought to it. So, you know, it's simply who they are, no? That actually showing up the way they do, I think, made it possible.
Great, thanks, Marina. So thumbs up. Yeah, so David, I wonder if on a related issue, you know, we often talk in the transformations community about the desirability of supporting co-production, knowledge co-production, and addressing disparities in power among knowledge practitioners. That was a topic of another panel we did yesterday for this conference, Decolonizing Knowledge Practice. How did you see that showing up, either at your site or in the network? These relationships between different knowledge communities and the inevitable power disparities between them, and how was that navigated?
Yeah, well, the network had two dimensions. One is the network of researchers, which is international and all that, and the other is the network of researchers plus the non-academics that participated in each of the nodes. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the former. So regarding the international network of researchers, because the other one is very complicated and it's very specific to each hub, right? Mm-hmm. But I think there were two elements, important elements for co-production and co-learning. And the first was developing and using the T-Labs, the transformation labs, as a flexible co-produced boundary object, right? Around which, and you know, Laura has already talked a little bit about that, but I think it's important to insist. Boundary object around which collaboration and learning within the network could be centered, right? In a sense, you know, co-developing and applying these T-Labs gave us like a common sense of purpose. And I think that's very important to have this common sense of purpose. And then the process of co-producing this T-Lab, the methodology itself together as a group and on the go, and then applying it in a very adaptive manner to each case, enable like a powerful process of learning together. And so the first is this boundary object element. And the second is to give self-reflection the status of a main project outcome, not something that you do as an aside, as an addition for evaluation purposes, which is also important, but to make it central to the success of the entire process, right? This status was there in theory on paper in the project proposal, but it had to be, we had to learn how to actualize it, how to make it happen, actually, in a sense. So on the one hand, each phase of the T-Lab was followed by self-reflections about what we had learned in that particular phase, right? But on the other hand, at the end of the 4 years, we engage on an explicit exercise to reflect about the whole experience, right? And this explicit exercise wasn't planned, but it was proposed. It emerged as a proposal by some members of the South Asia Hub, right? That we needed to dedicate explicitly some time to reflect together on the whole process, right? So each hub got to decide how to carry out this final reflection. Some were focused on self-criticism and through individual reflection or through some form of assisted self-reflective dialogue. And in the case of the North American and South American hubs, we decided to be inspired by an indigenous practice, the practice of journeying with country. Journeying has been practiced by Australian Aboriginal people, and it's based on a principle of reciprocity. And we combine Yarning Circle with Otto Scharmer's Theory U, and this is something that some of the participants, and I think it was Dwight who mentioned whether we had some connections with Otto Scharmer's work. But we combine Yarning with the principles of deep listening, which include in Theory U, downloading, factual listening, empathetic listening, and generative ways of listening. So we created a protocol acknowledging the indigenous origin of the practice and its main principles, and conducted a self-reflective listening circle where the chinampas, which is, and the crop seeds, which were the focus of the South American hub and the North American hub, were part of the conversation as beings, right? That was supposed to be, these beings were supposed to be part of the reflection. And it's important to mention that avoiding the cultural appropriation of Yarning circles is not just about explicitly acknowledging its Aboriginal origins or asking for permission to the holders of this knowledge. That's of course important, but it requires also to participate from a decolonized mindset that acknowledges the sacred nature of non-human beings and of the planet, of the land, right? Of the country, as they say, as Aboriginal people say. And we were able to get into that mindset meaningfully, I think, and meaningfully implement this Yarning circle, just because we have been sharing for a year or so in the context of the Pathways Network, a project that was focused on decolonizing methods, right? So we were, in a sense, practicing this decolonial mindset for a long time, and then we were in a position to do this in a meaningful way.
Fantastic, thanks, Debbie. Marina, I want to take that conversation kind of up a level to the network learning as a whole, the sort of internal reflection. There's been a lot of discussion in our community, transformations community, around the idea of developmental evaluation, the Michael Quinn-Patton idea that Glenn Page has taken into practice so effectively. And I wonder whether you can comment on that dimension of learning, how that took place, sort of the learning about the network, within the network, about its own effectiveness.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, so the term evaluation comes up, right? And it is one that the transformations community is grappling with, the action research community, I think, has been grappling with for a very long time. And it's a question that often comes towards the end of a project, which is sort of when I arrived into the Pathways Network. But I guess I should say it kind of reemerges, because it's often something that we talk about very early on, usually because our funders require us to tell them what our pathway to impact is, and then usually to say something about how you're going to evaluate and measure and show that you prove that you've achieved that impact, So then we come to grappling with these questions. And the challenge, I guess, and the opportunity that we had was to identify and think about language and approaches to evaluation, such as developmental evaluation, that could actually deal with the complexity, but also, as everybody's been talking about, this very emergent, open-ended process. So what is a TLAB? It's a process, right? The intervention, to use the evaluation language, is facilitation, right? The intervention is, in some ways, the mindset that David is talking about, like how you show up, right? And how you navigate context and how you decide what the next step is the intervention, right? So it's not something that's out there that you can structure and then you can sort of implement and roll out in a similar way. So it has this high level of diversity, as you've heard about, in the different hubs. There was these different ways in which the anchors that Adrian mentioned were then implemented, and it has this very open-endedness. So unpredictability in those pathways to impact, right? So how do you deal with that? Well, that's where methodologies such as developmental evaluation, or what we often call complexity aware, right? So the idea that you learn your way to change and outcomes versus simply trying to measure it, But I think there's also, and they've talked about a lot about the ways in which those reflective processes were happening within the hubs, but also across them. And that you could label that as developmental evaluation. But there's also, I think, and this is where I think the kind of field is moving, some acknowledgement that you can also be theory-based, right? And so if you articulate and make clear your plausible best guess, your ideas about how you think these T-labs might work and how they might create change at the outset, right, in some form of a theory of change, then that gives you the opportunity to do the double loop learning, to come back and reflect critically on the underlying assumptions, right? And that deepens our learning. And so the network did this through, at the outset, using the participatory impact pathway analysis methodology to develop theories of change, to map out the ways in which the different hubs would actually create shifts in knowledge, attitudes, practices, and systems dynamics around the specific challenges and people they were working with. So having that, and at the same time, reflected on their theories of transformation. So those two together enabled the sort of impact orientation, which meant that then, as Adrian explained at the outset, when there were those cycles of coming back, there was something you can come back and reflect on, right? Which should deepen your understanding of what you're achieving and should then enable you to course correct, which is what these kinds of approaches are aiming to do. And those kinds of shifts were visible in all of the hubs, no? Whether they were shifts and realizations around the roles that people were playing, or whether they were shifting orientation. So for example, in Argentina, where they started with a more policy change orientation, they ended up moving to a much more action-oriented orientation, right? And developing the BioLeft collaborative open seed platform that emerged. So that wasn't what they had planned, right? But they could use the reflective processes to learn and create that change. So there's definitely ways in which the double loop learning was happening within the hubs. And then when it comes to looking across them, and I guess to grappling with the really difficult question of causality, right? It becomes quite tricky, no? And it becomes tricky for a couple of reasons. One of them is that as normative, action-oriented, participatory researchers and facilitators, we're implicated in the process of change. We're very, very close to it, right? So stepping back and critically reflecting on the way in which your work is contributing to change is something that we find really challenging to do, right? Also challenging to find the time to do. But being able to do that with each other in the ways that have been described, whether it's around the paired hubs or the coming together across them, I think could enable much more of that than we often see in these kinds of collaborations. Then I think there's another big challenge which has to do with the temporality, and this has been mentioned already, I think, by Laura, the temporality of the actual processes of change that we're engaging with, right? And as Adrian said at the beginning, some of these relationships existed before the project, and of course they continue on now. So the real story of change is way outside the framework of the project, right? And the funded intervention, which is often where the learning and evaluation is located, right? So you have these two challenges of us as embedded participatory facilitators being able to step back and reflect on how it is that our work is contributing to change, and at the same time, the issue of temporality. And David has explained really well, I think one of the things that this particular network did really well was this triple loop learning, if you like, learning about our learning, and that process of really deeply reflecting on who we are and what we learned and the kind of self-criticism. That's really unusual, right? So layering those. So yes, that's developmental evaluation to go back to your question in some ways, but it's much, much more than that. And that I think it was layered across those levels. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Marina. Adrian, I'd love to hear at the sort of top level organizationally of the network, how this process of evaluation and reflection had implications for your management strategy and your relationship to the funders specifically, who, often would prefer formative, summative kinds of evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Marina talking there, it just reminds me how lucky we were to have her on the team, even if it was just towards the end. That kind of experience and awareness of, and having seen these types of processes emerge in so many other contexts, really, really helped us to understand. And also I wanted to, as well as what David was mention our colleague Dinisha Abrol from Jawaharlal Nehru University, who also was one of the people that suggested this self-criticism and reflection process after the end of the project, as in the formal end of the project. But that process in a way took on a life of its own. And to be honest, I think it was very little to do with management. It was just to do with what we felt was valuable in each of our hubs and learning across them. So I guess we'd started on that path. We'd got into the habit of looking at each other's experience from the outside, helping each other to understand what was happening, the kinds of things that were happening, the kinds of things that we were learning, which weren't so apparent to us, because, as Marina was saying, was so embedded in these hub-based processes, and it just carried on. I'm not sure. So it was really, really valuable. In terms of management, it certainly helped us, I think, at the to produce the outputs. It certainly helped us with the writing of the book, which took place primarily in 2020. So it was a difficult year for many of us. We weren't able to meet in person, obviously, but those processes certainly helped with trying to articulate what that triple loop learning looked like. For me, it also helped to illustrate that the network, the relationships, the trust were one of the really important outputs. Nothing that could be codified, just the tacit knowledge and the relationships and understanding that we will take forward for years and years to come. And I also wanted to just mention one thing about the funders, because I think many programs require you to lay out what you're going to do and then deliver, and deliver, on the outputs that you've promised to. And what Marina's described, and I think what we practiced in this network, was very much about changing what the plans were, abandoning some plans, adopting completely different approaches, and that was evident in several of the hubs. And some funders really wouldn't have liked that, but actually ISSC, I think, working with experts in this area, were almost expecting it. They were interested in transformations, not only research, but also transformations itself. And so we were even asked to report on what we'd changed our minds about and what we weren't going to do, what went wrong. And very, very few funders, I think, adopt that kind of approach. So I think that credit to them, and flexibility, at least on that point, is due.
Yeah. The funders themselves need to reorient to a kind of a learning perspective, and that's not always feasible, but fortunate. In our remaining time, I'd love to pivot to talking about how do we take the insights from an effort like this, and there are so many, organizationally, structurally, to inform other efforts, and perhaps inspire other efforts as well, to ensure that these kinds of initiatives are attempted again, and that they're improved upon. And so it's sort of a general question to all the members of the panel. How do we support other networks, other kinds of transformative support structures? What are the best methods for ensuring that there's continuity in learning at the meta level, beyond the network, but between networks within the community? And I'll just throw that as an open question to the members of the panel, whoever wants to jump on that one.
Yeah, and it would be maybe good to hear from not the other participants in the session as well, but I think very succinctly, I would say shift from a focus on outcomes to a focus on relationships, because that's what enabled the process to continue in a sense, and that was also fundamental to do things, to generate action, actually, right, based on the commitment to the relationships, actions that require maybe longer term perspectives, that require, transformative actions cannot happen normally as outcomes. They happen as changes on the ground, and these deeper changes have to do with keeping relationships in place, right?
Yeah. Anyone else want to talk about that? How we can promote this kind of learning within our community, broadly conceived?
Can I just say that I completely agree, David, and I would also say you can make the relational part of the outcomes or the important outcomes, and that way you can also focus energy on us collectively better understanding and indeed leading to some form of maybe measurement because that creates language around it and evidence, right, that can help some shifts, not all of them. I'm not suggesting they all happen through evidence, but I think actually focusing on that can also be helpful. And I guess I would also say to the shift that we see around kind of structure versus openness in the way we understand what these things are and what we're trying to achieve is what also I was kind of suggesting is happening in the evaluation community. And I think it can be a really positive kind of reinforcing methodology that can help Bruce link across the various networks.
Yeah, I hear you. So the value of these evaluation processes isn't only to the initiative itself. Yeah. So I see a question that is actually really apropos, which is, we're very interested in building capacity, and then the question is, what kind of capacity have we developed, and is it different when we link up initiatives and create co-learning between initiatives? So perhaps Dwight, if you're still on the line, would you like to ask your question? I'm thinking maybe David would be a good person to address it.
I just tried to phrase it in the chat because there's a lot of talk about learning, and we did a lot of reflection, and we had some great relationships, but then I thought this was all about transformational change. So where's the transformational change? Is it just that more people have more diverse relationships, or is there something else?
Yeah, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? It's in the case, I can speak for the case of the North American hub, right? The unit of analysis, let's say, of the transformation was the social ecological system, which is a very complex system involving power relationships, very powerful actors, and in a sense, big transformations or radical transformations, short term, were not part of the deal here. In a sense, I guess we have done a lot of self-criticism about why this didn't happen. Maybe we didn't have the right, powerful actors on the table. But then if we had had the powerful actors on the table, the process would have been completely different, right? We wouldn't have been able to create these relationships and everything, because the way in which these actors engage is probably not compatible with what we were doing and all that. There are lots of inertias, and so transformations are difficult because there is a lot of inertia and path dependency in these social ecological systems and all that. Our approach was, okay, we are gathering agents who are already operating, who are already changing or influencing the system to a certain level, right? Maybe they are not the most powerful actors influencing change, but they have some levers, right? And we are bringing them together and make them work together. And these are people who weren't working together previously, right? So our main mechanism for transformation was to bring actors who are agents who are relatively powerful, not maybe the most powerful ones, who haven't worked or collaborated together, and get them into this process of building this deeper form of relationship and see what they come up with, right? So not having an agenda of what we are transforming actually, but see, are they able to come up with some, and I think we had some small changes in the system as a result of that, not a whole transformation. The Chinampas are still being degraded, and urbanization processes are not stopped as a result of this and all that. But there were new spaces created for gearing or directing these dynamics into maybe a more sustainable way. So that's what I can say. But that's a really good question. Of course, it's one of the things that we struggle the most. Right?
Yeah, great question. Marina, would you like to pick up on that? I know it's difficult to do this work. There's no control group. I mean, how can you tell whether the network itself was value added on the individual initiatives that might have been perfectly capable of conducting their work independently?
Yeah, I actually think Adrian is best placed to respond to that, in the sense that not so much the control groups piece of it, Adrian, but more in terms of what you put in the chat. So it's clearly not about an experimental design in which you're going to be able to show net effect, right? And therefore be able to show transformation has happened. That's not the territory we're in, right? And so I think it's, as David was saying, is understanding what are the kinds of dynamics in a system and leverage points where you're trying to influence, right? And thinking about that influence as part of a long-term trajectory of change. But Adrian, you can say more about that, specifically about the different hubs. Yeah,
I mean, I could try, but there was a lot going on in each and every one of them. I'm best placed to talk about the work that happened in the UK, and in Brighton and Hove, the council, the local authority, initiated a participatory process to plan land use and sustainable land management of the area that it owns, the 4,000 hectares around Brighton and Hove, which was one of the recommendations that came out of our TLAB workshop, our second TLAB workshop. Now, that's a transformation that was already in train, and I think that we maybe injected some new ideas into it, and it's continuing now. But there are even more interesting, I think, and impactful stories that could be told from the Indian context, from the China context, very, very different contexts. But I think that transformative change is happening in each of the hubs that each of the hub activities has contributed to in some way. It does get much more difficult, I think, to raise it up to the network level and think about the value added. We tried to articulate the value added. We tried to articulate the transformative change across the network in the book, in the final chapter of the book, and drew from that takeaway messages, primarily for funders, but also for academics, transdisciplinary researchers that are planning, designing, supporting, and implementing these kinds of projects. So maybe, yeah, you know, Bruce, for the transformations community, that's a useful place to start looking. But
Yeah,
it's from where I sit, it's much easier to put your finger on the transformative change that is happening at the level of the hubs.
yeah, I hear you. You know, Adrian, I wonder, you know, you came into this without any formal training on sort of network management, if there is such a thing. And I wonder whether now that you've kind of emerged at the other end, whether you have any thoughts on how we should, as a community, prepare people for this, for the kind of work that you undertook, how to organize and lead transformations networks and in other kinds of initiatives. What kind of skills, what kind of capacity, what kind of temperament, kind of capability should we look for, and how should we try to create it? If you could sort of give advice to your younger self on how to prepare for this experience, what would you say?
Run. Yeah. No, I'm just make sure that you find yourself in the middle of an amazing team. It's not easy to plan, but yeah, I definitely feel that. I think working with Annabelle and having, you know, not just one person at the helm, kind of manage the word management is not one that I like. Convene, I prefer, I guess.
Weaver.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That's a new one that I've learned since hearing about this session. I've never thought of myself as a weaver. Might take some getting used to, but maybe that's what I am. But yeah, working across myself and Annabelle, I think that also when you're leading in a group or in a pair or in a group, it's seeing those complementary skills and bringing those to the fore. I think that, yeah, we both contributed in very, very different ways, but I think that that worked together quite well. Yeah, I guess don't try to manage. It's probably a takeaway.
Take your management book and throw it out the window.
Yeah. I guess if you try to manage, you definitely, I don't think that I would have survived, let alone the network, if it had been a management exercise.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
it's again the trade-off between rigidity and flexibility, and needing to favor the second one, right?
Yeah. David, do you have any leadership tips or management insight?
No, really not. Nothing to add to what Adrian said.
Yeah.
I wasn't leading necessarily. I was trying to all the time to promote co-leadership and horizontality and things like that. And it works when, as Adrian said, when you surround yourself with people who understand that and appreciate that and are able to operate under that. And it takes sometimes a cultural shift or some training, right, to operate in this space, because of course we are used to operate under hierarchical systems, right? Yeah. And we have to unlearn that. It's not, you cannot take it for granted, right? Yeah,
I hear you. Well, in our last few minutes, I'd like to give the panelists a chance to tell us what else is on your mind. You know, what did this conversation bring up for you? Are there unanswered questions you'd love to investigate? And then in part, that's part of our agenda in the transformations community, to support questions like that. Nick, you can put our link in the chat. If folks would love to join us, we can put you on our newsletter list and promise not to spam you. And we'll just keep you informed about other work that we're doing to support the transformations community. So panelists, what else? Do you have any final comments, thoughts, questions? Marina, why don't I begin with you?
Sure, thanks. No, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for the opportunity to reflect back and reconnect. And I think for me, what's come up is, and I guess this is about the broader community and how we build it, it's actually thinking about all of those different levels at which we're reflecting and learning and how we connect them. So the very deep personal to the collective that we do on a project in a community in a particular location, to what we then do as networks across locations, and then how that feeds up into some of the cultural shifts required in terms of the funding environment, the enabling environment, all of the kind of methodological infrastructures and academic infrastructures that get in the way of doing this work. So there's something at each of those levels, and there's a job to be done in figuring out how we seed and connect across.
Yeah, and the boundary work, another term that David brought up earlier, across those levels. Interesting idea. David, what about you?
Well, I will just mention that I look forward to continue thinking about how to continue this work in the context of the transformation community, I guess, right? So thanks for convening that. And I look forward to keep discussing with everyone else involved in this community about how to multiply this type of processes.
Yeah, thanks, David. Adrian?
So I think one thing that's struck me, and one thing that, a question, we've had a conversation, and it's been great. It's been really interesting. But there are other people in the network with other positionalities, and I think we could have had a really different conversation if they were the ones here, rather than myself, Marina, and David, and Laura. So what would be great is to have this kind of a discussion with our colleagues from India, from Kenya, and from China. They're working in very, very different contexts, and their contributions to the network were different, and I'm sure that their experiences were as well. So I guess that's another question, an open question for me, and one that I guess we always have to recognize that in these networks, the network itself looks very different from based on the positionality. And so it's great that we started with positionality at the beginning. Yeah,
I think we've come full circle. And that really resonates with David, your opening statement of, about, the constraints of the institutions we operate in. Here we are at an SRI conference. Then there's the transformations community. How do we open up these conversations and create the opportunities for productive, honest, generative learning, and where we bring practitioners into conversation with us and not just talk about them and their experience once we get together. So I'm going to take that to heart, and that's something we're going to experiment with, prototype, if you will, in the transformations community. Try to come up with a variety of different ways to engage practitioners with academics to cross the sort of action research divide. So thanks for that comment, Adrian. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking part in this really rich conversation. We will be following up, both summarizing this conversation and putting it up on our website, as well as social media channels and all that stuff. We're going to be hopefully bringing this discussion in an ongoing way into our own conference next year in Sydney, Transformations Community Conference, which will also be a hybrid event. So please attend. And just really look forward to learning more, reading your book, and learning more about your efforts and profiling you on our page. So thank you for the efforts you've done in pioneering this kind of work, which I hope continues and grows and is picked up within the world of transformations. And I'd like to thank Nick Graham, our organizer and the chief weaver of the transformations community, for your leadership in organizing the panel as well. So thank you, panelists. Thank you for taking part. Thank you, participants, and everyone who joined us today for this conversation, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, yeah, thanks. Great session. See you soon.
See ya.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
We're 3 for 3.